Good morning, everyone, and welcome on this fourth Sunday in the season of Easter. I'm the Reverend Derwin Kostanak, the priest at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Calgary, and I'm glad you've decided to join us this morning as we continue on in our series through the first letter of Peter. Now, those of you who are part of the congregation and receive my regular emails every week will recall that yesterday, when I said what the readings were going to be, I assigned you a rather lengthy reading, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through to chapter 3, verse 12, if I remember correctly. And this morning I am calling an audible. We're changing it up a little bit. This is going to be a rather curious day because I'm going to read you probably the shortest reading I've ever delivered for a sermon. And then this is a sermon that could go on forever. Let me just give you warning now. I try to limit it to 20 minutes, but there's a lot to unpack here, and there's going to be so much I can't say. In fact, that's going to be more of the challenge. What don't I say this morning on the topic we're going to cover? It's still 1 Peter, though, but it's just 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And so here is the reading for this morning. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that, though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. And so with those two verses, even there, it's going to be a little bit shorter in that I'm going to emphasize primarily one verse of those two verses. The reason we put them together is because they're a paragraph, so they're a complete thing. But this is what we want to drive at this morning. We'll get to the rest of it later. But today is an important piece. The first parts of the letter of 1 Peter here have served to get Peter established in what it is that he's trying to do. He is celebrating the gospel of Jesus Christ with these people he's writing to. He's talking about how precious the gospel is. He mentions to them that how this is not something that's strictly for their individual benefit, but for their collective benefit and really for their collective responsibility. They are all bricks in a building being built with a purpose of being a light to the world as a whole, to see the world benefit and be blessed by what it is that they share. And so now he's going to come into the practical part of this letter and begins with this paragraph that really sets the tone. It establishes, I would suggest to you, the theme for the rest of the letter, or if not the theme, it is at least the topic sentence for this portion that's coming up. But before we get into that, I want to invite you to try to set aside, first of all, any preconceived notions or presuppositions you have about what you read in the New Testament. I'm asking you just to set aside those things and let's just start fresh. Let's begin from a perspective that allows us to start as much as possible with a clean sheet of paper. The gospel assigned for today, which I didn't read, is John chapter 10. This is the chapter where Jesus will say, I am the Good Shepherd. It is Good Shepherd Sunday today, actually, so we should at least acknowledge that. But the reading assigned for today was the first 10 verses, and the last verse, Jesus says this, I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly. That's a summary statement. That's a statement that Jesus makes to really bring to a whole, or bring rather to a single statement, everything he's about, everything he said and did and demonstrated, is that we might have life and have it abundantly. These words were said before his crucifixion and his resurrection, but we can see that those things too would be included in all that Jesus said, did, and demonstrated. It would be that human beings would have life and have it abundantly. And so for the apostles, like Peter, for the other disciples of Christ who followed him around for those 3 years and heard his teaching and saw what he did and engaged with him and all the different experiences that were shared, they would understand that all of it had to do with Jesus fulfilling this promise that he made, this statement that he made. I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly. Now, let me ask you this question. I think would it make sense that having an abundant life would be something desirable? that having this life of wholeness and fullness that Jesus had been talking about would be something truly desirable. You'd want it. I think the answer would be yes. Now, someone might say, well, wait a minute, though, what does Jesus mean by an abundant life? And certainly that's a valid question, but just taking it at face value, I think we would recognize that this is something good. After all, we do see that in Jesus' life, he was surrounded by many people. People were following him from all over the place. They were really intrigued to see what he had to say. And people subsequent to his life have been very attracted by things that Jesus said. Even people who would not call themselves followers of Jesus, nevertheless recognized the really positive things that he had done. No, I would suggest to you that desiring an abundant life is something that everybody would want. In fact, even today, we have a number of motivational speakers who talk essentially about that. Tony Robbins has got quite an industry going about talking about things that would point to abundance. Not that there would be an abundance of things, but living life to the fullest. So, having said that, Jesus said, I've come that they might have an abundant life. That would be something desirable. Then, after Jesus' death, in which case everything was thrown into question, but then his resurrection, where the disciples were able to recognize that, oh my goodness, there's even more to it than what we saw. Now death isn't even part of the picture as far as Jesus is concerned. Before Jesus left on Ascension Day, he said to them something like this: go into all the world and make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them everything I have commanded you. Now, when Peter would have received those words and the other apostles with him, I think they would have understood that what their task was to do would be to continue on in the same vein that Jesus had. That all that Jesus had taught and instructed, the things that he did and demonstrated, would have served to help anybody who was paying attention understand what it is to have that abundant life. And how it is to have that abundant life. And to understand that this abundant life is something that is being offered to them, being held out to them, and that there is a way in which that can be realized. And so, as we now go to the New Testament and read the book of Acts and read the letters of Paul and read the letter of James and the letter of Peter like we're going through now, I think we can understand that their efforts were all meant to be in fulfillment of this responsibility Jesus gave them. Go, baptize, and teach everything that I have taught you. And part of what Jesus said is, I have come that you might have life and have it abundantly. So when we read 1 Peter, let us understand that this is what Peter is trying to do. He's trying to continue what Jesus began. He's trying to pass on to his audience 2,000 years ago in what is now modern day Turkey, these Christians who feel at odds with others because they're being persecuted. He is writing things so that they might understand this foundational promise that Jesus the Good Shepherd has given. So now let me ask you this question. If we understand that that is what Peter is trying to do in this letter of Peter, those of you who have read the entire letter will know that there's some stuff that makes you wonder, and it's like, how do we actually approach this, and so on. Certainly there are things that are puzzling, but let me ask you this. If you understand that Peter, having experienced so much with Jesus, saw all that Jesus did and said and demonstrated and participated in and experienced himself, and now understanding that Jesus said, now I want you to go and share this with other people, and Peter is now trying to share that, and he writes this letter that was written to these people and ultimately for us, does it make sense for us to be suspicious out of the gate for what Peter has to write? Does it make sense for us to treat Peter's letter with some kind of suspicion as, well, what's he really driving at? Let me ask you this. If you were one who was there with Jesus, if you had an encounter with Christ, if you saw what Jesus did, if you saw what he demonstrated and participated in it and were touched by it and affected by it, and you got the sense that this would be really good and this is something amazing that meant a lot to you, and you wanted to share with somebody else what you had experienced and what you had learned from Jesus, would it make any sense for me to treat you automatically with suspicion about what it is you would have to say? What reason would I have to assume that your efforts to communicate that good news that you experienced might have some nefarious alternative motive behind it. I don't think it would make any sense for me to do that at all. You're simply saying, here's what I experienced, here's what I saw. This is what I saw happen to somebody, what I saw happen to me. And so your description of those things, I think, can be taken at face value and not treated with suspicion, but instead said, okay, this is what you've experienced. This is what you've come to understand. And this is what you're going to pass on. That's what Peter is doing in this letter. He is not contriving to come up with some kind of religious creation so that he can control people or something like that. He's not trying to lead anybody astray. Quite the opposite. He's trying to lead them directly to Jesus. He's trying to lead them in the way that Jesus was saying they ought to live if they want to know that abundant life that Jesus promised. And so when we understand that, as we approach these letters, I think it will help us to keep in mind what's going on here. You know, it's been 2,000 years since these words were written, and so there's been a lot of history that has taken place. A lot of things have happened in the name of Christ and Christianity, a lot of things that ought not to have happened, a lot of horrible things, and I can appreciate how they can cause some people to feel kind of weird about the whole endeavor. Yeah, there's been 2,000 years of mistakes, as well as 2,000 years of successes in endeavoring to communicate what it is that Jesus had to say. But let us try to go back those 2,000 years to see what Peter is saying in his day, in the world in which he lived, to the people he had to speak to, and grasp that what he is saying is all part and parcel of understanding how to have the abundant life that Jesus promised to people. So when we come to today's reading now, and he begins this topic sentence for all that is going to continue, we need to understand that he is saying it as someone writing 2,000 years ago with knowledge that's 2,000 years old, or that's as far as it's gotten. And he's trying to describe things as best he can to help us get on the right track. And so what he said today was this: Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles. Let me just stop there for a second. Why would he use that language, aliens and exiles? There's two facets to this. The people he's talking to are aliens and exiles in a physical sense because they are people now who seem to be at odds with the Roman Empire and all that's going on. They're being persecuted. They're being treated as though they are not part of society in general. They are at odds. They are seen, as he says in the next sentence, seen as evildoers, that these are people you're supposed to be away from. So they're feeling exiled. They're feeling other. But also, in a spiritual sense, you could say that they are aliens and exiles because they're trying to live in a way that is certainly different from what people are assuming is the case. Their approach to living life, both in terms of its spiritual sense and its psychological, and then also its social sense and so on, is different. And so in that way, metaphorically, you could say that they are aliens and exiles too. So they recognize that they're at odds with those around them. And so in view of that, Peter says, Beloved, I urge you to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. There is his topic sentence. Abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Now, what does that mean? And again, I've asked you to try to put aside your presuppositions, the things you already figured this must be. I mean, obviously, right away for some, we're going to say, oh, this is talking about sin. You know, some would even say, oh, this is talking about original sin. About that really quickly, let me just say the notion of original sin was articulated in the 4th century by an early church theologian called Augustine. And, he hit upon a lot of interesting things, but I think over history, we have given him far too much credit and just assumed that he was right about a lot of things. And let me just go on record and say that I think he was wrong about the notion of original sin. Now, some people hearing that will think that I'm a heretic now. Okay, well, all right, we can talk about that. But this is part of the reason why this sermon could be hours and hours long, and I can't. So I got to leave that there. Let's eliminate that thought. Let's just take this as it stands. We have the desires of the flesh which wage war against the soul. So on this most basic level, what we see is there's something here that Peter says we're supposed to avoid because it could damage or destroy this other thing. And this other thing, apparently, is the thing that has to have greater value. The desires of the flesh wage war against the soul. Obviously, we need to guard the soul. We need to protect the soul. This is the important piece. Now, the soul, that word in Greek is the word psyche, from which we get the word psyche and psychology and psychoanalysis and all of these things, right? Having to do with our mind, our will, emotions, the center of our being. And I think maybe that's the best way to describe it, the center of our being. What does it mean to be who we are? What does it mean to be human? Jesus said, I've come that they might have life and life abundantly. And I would suggest to you that the condition of the soul has a direct link with us experiencing that abundant life. And so Peter, in wanting to pass on Jesus' message, is saying, look, there's something that we have to avoid for the sake of that piece of us which enables us to have that abundant life. Let me remind you again that when we talk about the salvation that is ours in the New Testament, where we talk about how Jesus saves, he's the savior of the world, that word salvation and savior has to do with being made completely whole, about this fullness that is to be given to us, what it means to be fully human. It's not just about being rescued from something. And so this being fully human will speak to this abundant life that Jesus is talking about. And the soul, Peter is saying, is integral to that. Damage to the soul will then create a problem with us having that fullness of human life, that abundant life that Jesus promised. So we need to guard that. It is interesting, he says, the soul, not just your soul. I think we've got something collective going on here that is needing to be understood. So what is that could damage or destroy the soul? The desires of the flesh, he says. So that means there are desires that we have. Desires are things that we want. Desires are things that we are attracted to. Desires are things that we naturally find ourselves drawn towards. And he says that we're supposed to abstain from the desires of the flesh. Let me suggest to you that word abstain does not mean you can't have anything to do with them at all. But instead, it would say that we need to be ones who are in control of the desires and not the other way around. The reason I say that is because when we try to articulate, well, what are those desires of the flesh? Well, here now, we got to recognize, of course, that Peter is writing in a day where he has knowledge that is limited compared to what we've learned over the past 2,000 years, especially over the past few hundred years. So he is trying to describe something that he only has so much knowledge for. There's only so much scientific understanding. And I would suggest to you today that the desires of the flesh are the things that have become part of our development over the course of our entire evolutionary process. Now, you've heard me talk about this before. I don't know if I've articulated it specifically, but let me just go ahead and say that now, that I am convinced that the mechanism by which God created all things is the evolutionary process we've experienced over the past almost 14 billion years. And part of how our human evolution has come is that we were given some key desires that were essential for our evolutionary development. I would say that these are the desires of the flesh. That's what we can identify as the desires of the flesh now, that Peter could not identify back then. Now, what are those desires of the flesh? Well, I got this information from a man named Michael Dowd, who back in 2012 had given a TEDx talk in Grand Rapids, Michigan, using the title of his talk being Why We Struggle Now. And he said, no doubt drawing from studies that he has done, that there are a couple of ways to describe these base desires, these essential desires to our development. One way is the 3 S's, our desire for security, sustenance, and sex. Or he said the other way you could do it is with the 5 F's. Those have to do with our instincts to fight, or flight, or freeze, or food, and copulation. Those desires are essential for our ongoing development through the evolutionary process to become where we are now. Without them, we would not survive. So we have to have, coming back to the 3 S's, that desire for sex because that's important for the propagation of the species. We have to have that desire for sustenance because if we don't eat, we starve and we die. And we need to have that desire for security because we need to be protected. I mean, part of the reality of this entire long history of the planet is we see that something ultimately gives up its life to feed another. And so predators and prey is part of reality. It's all the way it works. I was watching the rabbits outside of the church the other day, just yesterday as I was here in this beautiful, lovely day, and I would see them sprawled out in the grass. But even when they were taking this position of repose and closing their eyes and just enjoying the sun, their ears would be perked straight up. And every time there was a noise, you'd see that ear twitch just a little bit towards the source of that noise because of the desire of security. Last thing that the rabbit wants to have is to be caught napping literally and become dinner for somebody else. Okay, so where am I going with this? So we have these things. In our human evolutionary development, we have required and still have these desires for security, sustenance, and sex. But what was necessary for our ancestors 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years ago, living by those by default, is no longer appropriate for the place in which we live now, for this time in which we live, for this stage in our development, for our societal structures, for how it is that we have come to be as human beings, as Homo sapiens. And so when we give ourselves over to just live by those instinctual tendencies or desires, we find ourselves at odds with the way we ought to be to live that full and complete life. That abundant life that Jesus promised is not just a bubble bath of blessing for believers. It's not just an individual benefit for you, an individual benefit for me. No, what we see is that we are part of a collective. We are part of a family. We are supposed to be in this together. And the interesting thing, of course, is that Jesus made it clear that all of the blessings that God wanted to provide and everything that he was trying to illustrate down through the course of history was ultimately for the whole world. Even when it comes to Jesus' death, he died for the sins of the whole world. What do we see about the whole world? Well, we see the creation itself as a whole, of which we are a part. But even within humanity itself, we see that there is something, well, quite wrong about what's going on. The ancient language used in the Bible, with the creation myths at the beginning of the Bible, is telling the story of a garden and this tree and serpent and all this stuff, trying to make sense of how things have gone wrong. Well, let me ask you the question, does it look like things are going wrong? Well, I would say yes, and I'm not even just talking about a pandemic. Let's consider this for a moment. Part of evolutionary development that's even demonstrated in the animals is that not only is there that base desire for security, sustenance, and sex, but there is also in further development a sense that we are meant to be social animals, that we are meant to be together. And so we have flocks of birds and schools of fish. We have parliaments of owls and clouders of cats and a pride of lions and a herd of gazelles. We see that there is this automatic tendency that is towards working together. But of course, what we tend not to see is the pride of lions and a herd of gazelles mingling together peacefully. There is this separation between species, and that is why there's this desire and this need for security. The sustenance the lions seek by eating the gazelles requires the gazelles to have that desire for security to avoid being lion food. All the while, both lions and gazelles are propagating and growing and continuing on the species. My point is this, with human beings, we have come to a stage, though, of not desiring security against others that might harm us, but security against one another. Given over to this propensity for security, we now find ourselves in competition with each other, fighting each other. We have standing armies now. Why? Well, because some people want their standing army so that they can take something from somebody else. In the name of their own sustenance, their own survival, they are wanting to make sure that there's enough for them, and so they're going to take it from somebody else. And so an army exists for that reason. Conversely, there's a standing army for those who would want to defend themselves against such people. And the human race is at odds with itself. The desire for sex and propagation and all of that, when given its own run, leads to the exploitation of others and using others for our own self-gratification, or even, as is sometimes the case, as an act of terror against others. These naturally occurring desires, security, sustenance, and sex, left on their own and just given over on their own, lead us to live a very selfish life. Though we will still have a sense of kinship and unity and social structure within families and within nations and within affinity groups, all too often what happens is we end up seeing ourselves divided because of those things. And I would suggest to you that it does not lead to an abundant life. Why? Because now we live in fear. Now we live in fear of the competition of the other. We live in fear that someone might hoard the food and we would not have enough. Or, God forbid, we would be the hoarders and others would not have enough. In our desire for sustenance, we can find ourselves not taking good care of the creation and just simply taking and using it. Thankfully, people are thinking about sustainability these days. This is important. It's vital. God does not hate anything that God created, including human beings. And we are ones who need to be demonstrating what that means to be caring for all of the creation, including human beings, fellow human beings, literally our brothers and sisters. You can see that I could keep on going, and I have to bring this sermon to a close. Let me simply offer this to you. When Peter says, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul," he is saying, look, I want you to know the abundant life that Jesus talked about, that Jesus demonstrated, that Jesus came and did for us. And his death and his resurrection play a part in that as well. I want you to know this. And so in order to know it, you need to live lives that recognize that you need to be in control of your desires and not let your desires be in control of you. Now, it's natural to live according to our desires. And Paul hinted at this already in chapter 1. He said, like obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires that you formerly had in ignorance, things you did not know. And here I could launch into a long discussion about how the law helps us. The Torah was intended as a guide, but we can't go there right now. But don't be conformed to the desires you formerly had in ignorance. If you don't know otherwise, why shouldn't I seek this food? Why shouldn't I seek that sexual gratification? Why shouldn't I make sure I take care of that guy before he takes care of me? He said in chapter 1, verse 18, you know that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without defect or blemish. And now I could go in that direction to talk more about that. But we see in both of these verses this reference that there was a futile way or a desire conceived in ignorance or whatever that needs to be changed in order for us to embrace that abundant life in Christ. Now, this abundant life is something that is not the exclusive domain of Christians. Now, some people will say I'm a heretic for saying that too. Okay, well, I get it. But what I'm saying is God created this entire world. Human beings are created in the image of God. It should not surprise anybody that human beings are finding what God's driving at. We see as Christians, we recognize that God incarnate in Jesus Christ is some huge thing that God has done. And we add that to everyone else's story. Look, here's what God has done. Here's what Jesus has accomplished for us. The point is we see ourselves moving towards that. And what we are being called to as Christians, as followers of Christ, is to demonstrate ourselves how it is that we are to be engaging that abundant life. Not just that we might have it ourselves, but how others might participate in it too. Because our life will be abundant only when we see as many people as possible sharing in it. When we see the creation itself being cared for and included in what it is that we're living for. That our lives are marked by this recognition that we are tremendously loved by the God who created us. And we have the capacity to ruin it if we do not control the desires of the flesh, which wage war against the soul. So Peter says, please, I urge you, recognize that these things must not govern you. You must govern them for your sake, for the sake of all humanity, for the sake of the entire creation. Let us be people who demonstrate the peace of Christ which transcends all understanding, that it would be permeating in our world and shared by all in our world, that wholeness, that oneness, that shalom, to use a Hebrew term, that is promised to all things in Christ. That is our role. That is our privilege. Let us delve into how to do this as we continue on this day and onward. Amen.